we
This
can do the
conference will now be
suffer.
recorded.
So this is the last class in the ethics series. I hope it's been useful to you as it's been useful to me. People always say you learn the most by teaching, and that's definitely true for me. Often I learn the most while teaching because I will come across a concept that I never thought of before from you guys, and well, you'll show me why I've been wrong on something. And you guys have been really good at feedback. I really appreciate the feedback and making me think about these issues a little bit more too. And I hope that I guess I hope the benefit has been mutual. So it's good to have Elijah and his family here. I know you guys have been looking forward to having them up here. I know you're proud of them and what they want to be doing here. So we're glad to have them here. It's good to meet you. Like I said, sorry I won't actually be here to really get to know you because Laura and I will be moving down south, but hopefully we'll be able to come back up and visit sometime. So last week we kind of rounded or ended the discussion on some specifics regarding virtue ethics. We talked a lot about the different lists of virtues that are listed in the scriptures. The more intellectual-minded virtues, such as the ideas in Philippians 4:8. Things you ought to set your mind on, and how really the idea of being a good person and being a virtuous person begins with the life of the mind and having intellectual virtues, being able to think about things which are true and honest and good and pure and noble, and things that have, I guess, praiseworthiness and virtue in them. We talked about very practical virtues, say in 1 Peter 3 at the end of the chapter, talking about true wisdom. Wisdom is that, I guess, that practical application of the knowledge that you have, and it's applied to the world and your specifically your interpersonal relationships. And so we talked about things like being pure and peaceable and being open to reason. That one is specifically one we focused on. But the idea of virtue and the study of virtue is quite a, I guess, ponderous study because there are so many different aspects of virtue. There's so many different virtues, really. And it's interesting. I think the more that you look into this idea of virtue, the more you'll find that certain virtues will start to blend into each other. And it's sometimes hard to define, where one ends and the other one begins. So you get this idea that beyond all of them is God. And he kind of, he is, I guess, fully expressed in our lives through those virtues. And I wanted to mention this. I've tried throughout this class to draw from what I've read on these particular subjects that we've been talking about. And last week I tried to do that, so that you can go forward in your own study. I mean, obviously the Bible is the place to start and the place to end, and that's our basis for understanding Christian ethics, because that's our basis for understanding Christianity. So that's evident. But beyond that, there are what people have thought about different specific issues and how they have expounded on them from the scriptures, or maybe from their own individual philosophies and the effect that they've had on our world, specifically on the Western world, and on us, and on the way we think about such issues. And so I try to kind of point you to some good, extra curricular sources for that type of thing. And to round up the idea of virtue, I wanted to mention the famous book, I can't remember the author of it, maybe I should have thought of that, The Book of Virtues. You know who wrote that? He was a politician at some point, I know that. The Book of Virtues, pretty. Maybe you ever watch the show? Old, well, my age, I don't know when the show came out. I remember being a kid and watching the show. It was a cartoon. It was called The Book of Virtues. And it was actually based off of a lot of the stories found in the actual Book of Virtues. It had a lion as a character, was it? William J. Bennett. That was his name. That's right. Same thing. Anyway, that's an excellent book. It's really an anthology. It's got a bunch of stories and excerpts from a lot of different sources in, you might say, the Western tradition that have been conglomerated over the years. He kind of puts them in particular, categories. So he's got like a friendship chapter, and he's got a compassion chapter, and he's got a courage chapter, and the stories that have to do with those types of things are particularly geared towards children. But I haven't read it to my kids yet; they're too young. But I read it for myself all the time, and incidentally get a lot of sermon ideas from those all the time too. And it's really an excellent source for what Bennett called, not just an intellectual education and not just the practical side of teaching your children how to be moral. There's this idea of moral education too. There's the intellectual side of morality. It's kind of really building on the ideas of Philippians 4:8, thinking about things with their virtue. That's really where the acting of virtue comes into play, and that's where it starts, really, is when you can think about those things. So anyway, that's an excellent source called The Book of Virtues by William J. Bennett. Now, I wanted to get into this last week and didn't have time because the discussion carries us where it will, and that's perfectly fine. I enjoy that. But I wanted to talk specifically about, I think, some specific moral issues that we deal with in the churches of Christ today, and the things that we have traditionally talked about and emphasized, and perhaps have had disagreements on. Now, I always realize how dangerous of a study and a discussion this type of thing can be, because since there are so many disagreements on it, we have the capacity for some, I guess, turmoil. But I think so far what you guys have shown me is that you're very open to discussing disagreements even amongst yourselves. That's what it seems like. This group here is open to talking about how you feel about things and what you think the truth is regarding certain issues. And you don't get angry or start hating each other when we disagree. At least I hope that's not true, because a lot of you have disagreed with me on quite a few things, and I hope you don't hate me. And I definitely have appreciated the different thoughts that you've given to me. But what I wanted to particularly focus on now was sexuality, sexual sins. Now, I think this particular issue has to be talked about with some care, because there's always, and I don't really know why, it's really a mystery to me, why sexuality is such an uncomfortable topic to us. Now, it's uncomfortable to me too. I mean, I'm not outside of this sphere of, sex is kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about. I'm not one of those people that's just completely fine with talking about it. And, any sort of detail regarding sexuality is, that's fine, we can talk about it. I'm not really like that. I have those emotions of, I guess, inhibitiveness. Inhibitions. That's right. Inhibitions, just like probably you do. But I think it's still important to talk about these things within certain contexts and to certain degrees, depending on the particular people present. So, bear that in mind as we talk about this. But I think that sex is particularly a problem for Western Christians. And I say Western Christians as opposed to Christians in general, because depending on the culture in which you've grown up and the culture, let's say, in which you've grown up as a Christian, there can be some differences. It seems to me that, at least before, in Eastern culture, sex was seen very much differently. And it wasn't as, it never was really, as far as I can tell. Maybe it's different now, I don't know. I only know about in ancient times, it really wasn't as, I guess, verboten of an idea, a topic to speak about. Now, for the West, I think it has become so, and it's kind of gone in sort of a roller coaster type fashion, as far as I can tell. The issue as I see it is that you have, say, the Victorian era. That's probably the point of history in which we could say this is why and when and where it happened. When people really started to repress discussions on sexuality in anything other than, say, a professional, psychological, or medical field. Like in polite society, you didn't discuss that side of human nature, right? And I think all of us can agree, and most of us today do agree with, even especially non-Christians would agree, that that's probably not the healthiest way to go about dealing with that very large part of human life. I mean, obviously, if it weren't for sexual relations, there wouldn't be human life as we know it right now. None of us would be alive here if it weren't for that. So, it's not something you can just say, we don't need to think about, right? And obviously, looking at the history of sexuality throughout the world, it's something we do need to think about. Specifically because in Christians and the scriptures, and by extension, therefore, God himself teaches some pretty specific rules regarding sexuality. And so what we've seen now is sort of a shift away from that sort of conservative aspect of sexuality, where it's not only, I guess, tightly repressed, as some people would say, although I think that's probably a misnomer. It's also not talked about. That's an issue, and it's an issue for this reason. If you don't talk about something, especially if it has some problems attached to it, the problems are only going to grow. Issues don't go away because you ignore them, right? If you want an issue to not go away but to be resolved as much as possible, you've got to talk about it. You've got to think about it. And sometimes it's a very unpleasant thing to do, but a necessary thing to do. Now, I think the problem is the pendulum has swung too far the other way. Now we're at a point, at least in Western culture, where, well, I'll put a caveat onto this, but for most of the end of the 21st century, or the 20th century, and on into the 21st century, we've been at this point where pretty much anything goes, right? And that's regarding what you can say, and to whom you can say it, and what you can do. Now, there are definitely some limits to that. You might say some legal limits that we feel that still should be in place as a society. But the traditional moral norms have almost completely gone away. I don't think we can safely agree that that's where we're at right now. Now, I guess what I'm arguing for is for maybe a little bit of a middle ground there. And I think there's a particular issue that's come up. This is the caveat to all this. Now, within the last few years, which has been to me really, really surprising. And Jordan Peterson, who's, like I said, somebody that I probably mentioned way too much, that's probably because of my lack of breadth in knowing about other intellectual sources that I just go to this one guy or just a set few people. That might be true. Either way, I really like some of the things he says. And this was one of them that particularly stuck with me. He said, Western culture is too immature right now to have a serious discussion on sexuality, and too immature to sit down and figure out what are the lines of what we should do sexually. What should be our rules? Because it seems like he says, in the 1960s, you have things like the birth control pill and other things, which you can control reproduction to a certain degree. And it gives, women especially a lot of power over that particular system. And so he's like, well, everyone said, okay, well, let's just go ahead and party now, and we can do whatever we want, and there are no consequences to it. Then come the 70s, and you've got, a huge outbreak of STDs, and you find there are a lot of other problems involved in sexuality besides just unwanted pregnancy. That's not the least of the problems, but it's only one of them. So we're getting to this confusing point, and now it's been absolutely astounding to me that you might say the political left is kind of who traditionally or before had been the voice in our society saying, yes, we should be able to do what we want sexually. Now the political left is almost becoming a little bit more repressive than I would have thought possible. The ideas of, well, I guess the specifics are kind of unnecessary at this point, but the ideas of, I guess, well, I don't know exactly what specific I should give. There are so many of them, and it's such a complex issue, and I didn't want to get into it too deeply. But anyway, I think what's going on in the political left right now is really astounding. As far as they almost seem to be putting more rules on sexuality than even the conservatives are. Regarding consent and that sort of thing, and I guess the common discussions on what constitutes sexual harassment. Right, so we can talk about some of the good effects of the Me Too movement and possibly some of the bad ones, and also what constitutes sexism, as far as attitudes towards women and treatment of women and that sort of thing. A lot of these things, a lot of the lines have been drawn pretty strongly, and it almost seems as if maybe we need to rethink these things before we get into extremes. As far as I can tell, how the church has reacted to this has been, in some sense, maybe too extreme. Now, there are two extremes that I can see. And remember, we talked about what virtue was. In Aristotle's idea, virtue was the golden mean between two extremes. So, for instance, we have the virtue of courage. Now, what's one extreme of courage? Yeah, foolhardiness. You're just an idiot. You're not being courageous. You're doing stuff which is completely useless and worthless and too much, I guess, right? You're taking courage to its fullest extent. You're going too far in that extreme. Now, what's the other extreme of courage? Cowardice, right? You could be so afraid that you don't do anything. So there's a golden mean there. There's a moderation in which you need to approach this, where you know what you want to do, and you realize you're afraid to do it, but you do the appropriate action in the appropriate way to or for the appropriate reasons and persons. So that's the virtue between two vices. Now, I think we've kind of come across the same type of dichotomy regarding sexuality. On one extreme, you have pretty much wantonness, right? Pretty much you can do anything you want as long as you're not hurting someone else. And honestly, some people say even if it does hurt someone else. That has been the logical conclusion of wantonness. Now, that's not socially acceptable, but for a lot of people, and by the way, for a lot of different cultures, it is. If you can do what you want, then where will that stop? Why let it stop at harassment? Why let it stop at rape? And that's a legitimate question. But look at the other extreme. What would you say would be the extreme towards which maybe a lot of even Christians have gone regarding sexuality? What are your thoughts?
Asceticism.
Asceticism. So can you unravel that or explain that a little more?
I mean, it was a problem that Paul was dealing with in Colossae. They had gone so far that in order to be holy, you needed to abstain from any kind of contact.
Right.
But even the thought wasn't wrong.
Right. So I would say like wantonness on one end and prudery on the other, right? And that's true. That's. Is there any other thought on the extreme as far as that goes? Anything else you want to add before I say my piece? Well, there was this book I read recently. It was written by a Wisconsinite, Linda K. Klein. It was called Pure. Something about, I can't remember the subtitle exactly. It's called Pure, and it was about the evangelical purity movement, which the Church of Christ has been, a part of, really, if you look at it carefully enough. And she says it's about the kind of the oppressions of the evangelical purity movement and how I left it. Now she's I think Episcopalian now or something like that. I don't know what group she was in before, but it was a more conservative evangelical type of group in Christendom, generally speaking. And so she talked about a lot of things regarding, her experience as a young girl, especially growing up in a climate that was maybe a little bit too extreme towards one end. And, I think she said a lot of things which were unfair because, I think she even mentioned the Church of Christ a little bit in that book. There's a friend of hers that was in it. She included us in that group of the, conservative evangelicals, vying for the purity movement. Maybe a lot of them heard of, or maybe even participated in Purity Day, right? It was something that I always remember growing up. Laura remembers this too, when the teenage girls would get together on, it'd be like a young ladies' day, but it was themed around purity. And I always thought it was interesting because purity, as I see it, is a virtue, right? A virtue which has two extremes, just like the virtue of courage and let's say, of chastity has two extremes. And yet it was always defined by its negative. It was never defined as a positive virtue, right? Basically, purity means if you're not married, you don't do this, right? You don't have sex. You don't do inappropriate things with people of the opposite sex, right? That's how you define purity. And even as a child, I always thought, well, that's not a very good definition. I mean, there must be something positive towards which I can achieve. If it's just defined negatively, maybe that doesn't seem like that's a very healthy definition or a healthy mindset to give to anyone. The other thing I always thought was, well, how come the guys never had purity days? I mean, are we not expected to stay pure? But the guys never did. I had never been to a male purity day. Now, maybe there was one or a few. I don't know. But it seemed as if, and this was Miss Klein's in the book, this was one of her objections to it, was that it was always focused around feminine sexuality. And I think there is, like I said, she was unfair to us in many ways. I think she also did some vast overgeneralizations. Yeah. But besides that, I think she had some good points. And one was this, that the ideal feminine character, or I might say ideal feminine archetype, which is presented by many Christians, is the virgin, right? The pinnacle of what a woman can be is the woman who is untouched by a man, essentially. And I think there is a problem with that view. And maybe you think, well, that's not true. People don't see that as the ideal. But I encourage you to look throughout the history of Christian art, represent like image-based art, visual art. That's what I'm thinking of. Visual art, as opposed to literature, and especially regarding the purity movement. And look at the sermons and the books that surround this, and you will find, I think, that maybe unconscious ideal is definitely there. Now, she had a problem with that, Ms. Klein did, because, well, obviously, that's not the ideal. That's not woman in her full potential, right? I mean, as far as I can see, the archetype of the woman who has reached her full potential is the mother, right? Not only has she grown up and matured in a physical and emotional and, say, intellectual sense, she's grown up as a person, she's also created another person, right? Like, she's participated in the act of creation, and she is even more so like God, right? The image of God exhibited and manifested in her than she was before. So that's kind of my initial thought of what an ideal woman should be. And of course, a mother is by definition not a virgin. And so it is interesting that you have sort of these two ideals kind of brought up against each other. But I still think it's really interesting, just from a literary and sort of symbolic point of view, that Mary, mother of Jesus, kind of encapsulates both of them in one. She was a virgin and yet a mother at the same time. Now, obviously, none of you ladies in here could possibly, achieve that. Well, fair enough. But I think that's an important thing to think about is how we picture women. And another issue that Ms. Klein had, and I encourage you to read that book, you will disagree with a lot of it if you do. But I think it will help you to kind of get our movement and our particular, the history of our particular ideas in perspective, and maybe see how sometimes we've gone a little bit too strong on this and maybe weren't perhaps as loving as we ought to have been. But I think one issue particularly is that we see Well, Freud had this interesting idea about taboos. And a taboo is basically anything which was something you didn't approach or had some sort of curse attached to it, right? It's a psychological concept in that sometimes the object itself doesn't have the quality, it only is you perceive it as such. And Ms. Klein and many others, I think Freud included, would say at some point women sort of become taboos. And I thought about this because of my own experience. You probably have heard of scenarios like this a lot. When, let's say, we're dealing with the issue of modesty and maybe they're dressing immodestly, and not in Paul's sense in 1 Timothy where they're wearing too much. It's actually the opposite, where they're wearing too little, usually, in our case. And so you've got, let's say, a guy who's handing out the Lord's Supper, and he sees, there's a woman sitting there that he wants to serve the Lord's Supper to, and she's dressed immodestly, and it bothers him, and it really tempts him, and it makes him angry. That's usually the response. And I've seen this a lot, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this type of scenario before, but I've seen it a lot over the years, and I've even ran across it just last week. Someone else mentioned, I think it was on Facebook, somebody saying that the same type of scenario where you run across a woman who's inappropriately dressed, and it bothers you as a man so much, and it makes you angry. Now, I don't know, maybe I comment this just naturally from a different perspective. Because whenever that would happen to me, my first response wasn't like anger. I didn't get angry. I mean, maybe I could think of in some cases, but the fact is, there's more than one thing going on here, right? There's the woman, of course, who's dressing immodestly. That's an issue to talk about, definitely. But there's also the man, and he's involved in this too, I think. And I can't help but wonder if anger is really a projection that you put onto them when you're really feeling angry at yourself for desiring her in the first place. That's an idea behind taboo, is that you have the feelings regarding a certain object, and yet you project the evil of that, I guess, onto the person. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that the woman dressing immodestly isn't doing what's wrong. That's another point. That's the particular point that we have been good at addressing, maybe a little too good at addressing. The other point is, what about the man? And this is the thing, and Klein mentioned this a lot, and I saw this a lot too. I saw this with people in my own family, the women in my family, what they taught, say, my sisters and the girls, which was basically your responsibility as a woman is to protect the men. Because the idea of listen to that is they really can't do anything for themselves. If it was up to them, they would sin every time. They're like animals that don't have control over their own bodily functions, right? Or their own needs or desires. So it's up to you to make sure that you dress right, and make sure that you protect our leaders. Right, now, wait a second. This is what I thought. If man is supposed to be the leader in the church, then the responsibility is on him. And that's a really important point. I think what we've done, now, like I said, and then there's fault on both sides when something like something like that happens, I think. Not in every case, of course. But I'm not, in other words, I'm not trying to completely, pass the buck away from the women, definitely not. But I think there's a shift in attitude we need to have, which is that if we're going to say that man as a general rule in the church has a leadership role, then the protection needs to happen from us. And I think that it's been a huge cop-out, not just in the church, but in general, that we always put the blame for lust on the woman and the temptation for sexual sin on the woman. It's never the man's fault. He never has, bears responsibility for it. Now, I know this is a vast generalization, because I can think of instances where the man was, he took responsibility, or the surrounding community made him take responsibility. And, that has been a backlash you see in the culture at whole. I think with the Me Too movement, that's exactly what's happening is, we're not going to let guys just do what they want to anymore. A lot of stuff has been happening, you might say under wraps, and people haven't been coming out with it. And now we want people to be able to talk about it. And, sexual assault in the Church of Christ too, has been a huge problem for a long time. And the reason we didn't know about it is because nobody was talking about it. And I think, we need to kind of clear out some of these issues and create an environment in which both sides can be heard. Now, the problem with Klein and her book was that she basically said, it doesn't really matter. I'm free from that movement and the bad things about it. They're behind me, and pretty much you can do whatever you want. It's like, if she had just kind of brought us back to the scriptures and what God actually says about sexuality, that would have been perfect. Because the fact is, human beings are imperfect, and we're going to go from one extreme to the other. That's the thing about virtue, is none of you in here are perfectly courageous at every point in your life. you don't always reach, and probably never reach, exactly the golden mean that is the ideal of Aristotle, right? You're always maybe just a little bit too foolhardy or a little bit too much of a coward. And we're all probably a little bit too much, let's say, following after wantonness, or maybe a little too prudish. We're never completely chaste or pure. That's the thing, is it's an ideal. It's something you strive toward. And I think if we see it that way, then maybe it'll help us to understand how to deal with sexual sin. And I think on a more basic nature, the nature of sex and sexual sin in itself. Yes.
And just to kind of say why this is an important discussion, wasn't it you who was telling me that they did a study of child abuse or child molestation within the churches of Christ, and it generally was geared toward those congregations that were less likely to talk about it, was where it was occurring?
The more conservative churches were the ones that had most cases of sexual assault. And the reason, I talked to this guy he deals with this around the Church of Christ. He was at the Midwest Preachers Retreat in Black River Falls 2 years ago. And he's a preacher, and he was a preacher, he's a psychologist. And he consults with a lot of churches that have a lot of issues that surround a lot of those types of things. And so he kind of goes in and he kind of advises them on how to go forward and deal with that type of thing. And so he's done this study of the Churches of Christ specifically regarding this. And he told me that the conservative churches were the ones that were most likely to have that sort of sexual abuse happen. And the reason was, well, in a conservative culture, let's say in a church, there's a lot more trust. There has to be. Because if you're more conservative, that means you're a little bit more, whether right or wrong, is beside the point. You're more closed off to the outside world. And when you're less trusting and closed off to the outside world, then you're more trusting and more open with, and you have to be by definition, to each other. And there are a lot of very simple things that you can do to fix that particular problem. But the fact was, that's where people can be taken advantage of much more easily. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be conservative. It doesn't mean. I guess I'm not speaking on that level right now. I'm talking about what's actually happening now. And right, in that particular instance, there's also that other correlation. Whether or not it actually is a causal factor, I don't know, but it is a correlation that those are the churches where you talk about sexuality less. So I guess all in all, point well taken. We've got to talk about this. It's an essential element to ethics, to Christian morality, right? But I think as we get into this, I want to go to the beginnings of sexual sin for us, which really is the beginning of sin itself as we perceive it. And that's going to be in Genesis chapter 3. So, let's see here. Now, there's a common formula which really encapsulates every temptation that I can think of, and sexual sins would fall into this category as well. And it's in Genesis chapter 3, and let's see, verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So the first sin committed by mankind had these three particular qualities about them. First was that she looked at the object of her desire, let's say, the object which she would use in order to sin. And it says that, first of all, it was a delight to the eyes. Second, that it was desired to make one wise. Oh, sorry, the first one was that it looked like it was good for food. The second, that it was a delight to the eyes. And the third, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. Now that has been compared to a little formula that John writes in 1 John. Remember, every temptation that is basically that you can encapsulate every temptation individually into these three main categories: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. I think he's drawing from these three things here. And you can see what's really going on. The lust of the flesh is kind of on the biological level, right? It's the level of instinct. It's the physical desire. And it's interesting, God gave us physical desires, but it seems that sometimes they can run rampant. And that's the thing, and this is important in understanding the virtue of chastity or of purity, is that it's not that your physical desire in itself is the evil, right? I mean, you're created to desire. Otherwise, there'd be no way or reason for us to get married and to have children, or to have that love, that sexual love which exists in the marriage relationship. There's no reason to have that. There's no ability to have it if you don't have the biological instinct for it. We have that, and animals have that too. That's one, I guess, connecting point with us and the animals, is we both have the biological instinct for sex. But there's something which goes beyond for us, which animals don't have, and that's the second part, which is the lust of the eye. I think that is a symbol, you might say, for the mind. You might say the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye. She saw not only that was good for food, but that it was pleasing to the eye. There's sort of an aesthetic ideal behind that. This is one of the spiritual desires that we have. We don't just have a desire for physical enjoyment, right, like food and sex and water and sleep and those things that we need and sometimes enjoy. We also have sort of a spiritual desire. We have a desire for beauty. We have a desire for a meaningful experience. That's a huge, and that's, I think, a God-given desire as well, but sometimes that can take us too far. And we can, I guess, put that aesthetic ideal up above the will of God. And the third element here is what John calls the pride of life. And I think that's connected to what is said in Genesis, which was that the tree was desired to make one wise. Now, the connection I make between the pride of life and being wise is exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14. What does knowledge do to you? What can it do? Right, it puffs up. Knowledge, wisdom, especially wisdom of the world. Read James 3 and you'll see that. It can give you pride. That's the thing. I think this thirst for knowing is another spiritual desire which is inherently within us. Obviously, the whole idea of eating the fruit was that it was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve wanted to know. As a matter of fact, remember in King James, at least, in Genesis 4, when it talks about Adam and Eve having their sexual union, it even says that Adam knew his wife Eve. So knowing has the sort of experiential element to it as well. It's not just propositional knowledge always. It's experiencing something. And often that is what lies behind all of our temptations. We want to know what that would be like. We want to appreciate the meaningfulness of this particular activity. Beyond just the physical desire, we have the aesthetic desire, and we have the desire to know what something would be like. And of course, all of these things do apply to sexual sin as well. Now, the problem was that this is really baffling to me. That throughout Christian history, in our art, you can see it especially in our visual art, and often in the theological writings of the early church and medieval church, and really up till today, is for some reason we always, I at first only saw this as implicit, I didn't see it as explicit, but when you start looking at the visual art of Christian groups throughout the centuries, you'll see it as very explicit, that the forbidden fruit is associated with sexual sin. Why? Because if you look at the story, there's nothing about sexual sin that's involved in that particular episode. There wasn't anything happening regarding sex, but for some reason we automatically connect the two. At least a lot of people do. Think about it. You always refer to, say, a woman you can't have in the movie. A lot of times you'll say that's forbidden fruit. And really, you can apply that to anything. And that's the important thing, is it does apply to sex in that it applies to every type of sin and temptation. Every sin that we come up against and every temptation we have to sin falls under one of these three categories, or all of them, which is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We want to be fulfilled physically, we want to be fulfilled spiritually, or we want to be fulfilled aesthetically, and we also want to know. We want to know what something would be like. Sex, I think, sexual sin can encapsulate all of those things, and any other type of sin can as well. But I think our problem in the church has been that we put sexual sin, particular sexual sins, above other ones. And I think that's been our main issue. Now, there is interest, that idea of hierarchy of sin is interesting in itself anyway. Now I know James says in James chapter 2 that if you break the law at one point, you've broken the law, right? I mean, James, did I say James? No, it's chapter 2. And if I'm right, no, it's chapter 1. If I'm right, what did you give? You give me another book? He gave me like 10 books today, so I can't read this chapter.
You have all the chapter 1 memorized.
No, it's chapter 2. It's James chapter 2. I can go right with the book. What do you think it is? 4? Anyway, yeah, well, if you can find the verse, read it for us.
Yeah, that's 2 in verse 10. Whoever keeps the whole law but fails one point, guilty of all.
Right. So I always see it this way, like the law of God is this pathway for life. And you can walk down it, and you have to get from this life to the next one, you have to walk in it, right? The path is given to you by God. Now, you can go off the path on say, this side turn, or you can go off the path past this bush. You can go off it at different points. You might say these represent different types of sins. But either way, you're going off the path. And that's an important point. And so the idea of hierarchies of sins on a spiritual plane, it doesn't make much difference or make much sense, because like what we always say, the age-old adage of Christians is sin, and it's wrong either way you look at it, no matter what type of sin you do. Now, that being said, it's also obvious that some sins have worse consequences than others, right? I mean, your partner in walking on the road with you will have a worse consequence if you go off at one point as opposed to another. Like, for instance, stealing, say, a candy bar from a gas station is wrong, it's a sin. But murdering someone is also wrong, it's a sin. And one has a bigger consequence, earthly speaking, than others.
You're going to say on earth.
Right. Now,
that's all the same.
Right, that's an important point. So that's why I made that distinction between the analogy of the pathway. That's on the spiritual level. Sin is sin. You break it at one point, you've broken the law. He says you're guilty of all things. So it's almost as if you break it at one point, he says, particularly if you say don't murder but do commit adultery, you're basically just as guilty as if you had committed murder and adultery. Doesn't make any difference. But it's still obvious on an earthly sin. Thank you for that caveat. That some sins have more consequences than others. I think that's been our issue, is that we base how we react to certain sins on how much of a consequence it's had in this world. So I was just reading a story, for instance, in the Christian Chronicle, this last edition, I think it was, where there's this guy, I won't name him or name the church because I don't remember who they are. And even if I did, I will try to protect privacy. But this guy, basically, he was a youth minister for a long time, a volunteer youth minister. And it came out that he had sexually assaulted a lot of the boys throughout those many years that he was a youth minister. Now, the issue was, well, first of all, he was convicted by a court, and he was told by the judge, you're not allowed to go back to that church or to any church right now unless the leaders of the church give you written permission to do so. Now, the elders thought, well, we need to be forgiven, and we want to make this right, so we were going to give him the permission. Problem was, a lot of his victims were still worshiping at the church. And of course, they didn't like the idea. The family didn't like the idea of him coming back, but it caused too much pain. So, of course, they, under the really, I think, shameful thing for the elders, as far as I can tell. Now, the story may have been colored. I guess I shouldn't say one way or another who was right or who was wrong. It's a difficult situation to think about, I can also think about who was the guy. I guess I won't name him either, although you may know who he was. He was in charge of Apologetic Express for a long time. And he was found out to have done pretty much the same thing, molested young boys at a certain age. And, I always wondered what happened to him now. He did a lot of good writing for the Brotherhood, for Apologetics. He is a guy. I've heard a lot of rumors about where he might be. And as far as we know, he just dropped off the radar. Of course, they fired him from the job. I mean, that makes sense. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But the question is, what's our standard for how we react to a sin, as far as the Brotherhood is concerned, right? So, for instance, in Memphis, I knew, let's say, 2 guys in Memphis. And the details of this would be somewhat changed because I want to protect the privacy of people, just in case you happen to know them. When I was at Memphis School of Preaching, there were, let's say, 2 guys. One was a former drug addict and drug dealer and gangster, right? And he had killed someone at a certain point. Now, obviously, he repented of his sin. But he could talk about that, and everyone kind of thought, honestly, I think a lot of people thought he was kind of cool. Now, there's another guy who used to be, well, basically anything short of a male prostitute. And he couldn't talk about his. That wasn't cool, was it? And as a matter of fact, it seems as if he was maybe a little bit more alienated than the other guy. And I can't help but wonder, what is it about sexual sin that irks us so much? What is it that makes it so much worse than, say, anything else? What do you think? Am I wrong? Am I saying this? That's not how we judge these sins? Is that not what your experience has been? What do you think? It is a touchy subject, isn't it? How do you talk about it? Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with your point that all sins, why we decide what sins are greater or lesser value is a moment that changes throughout the history of mankind and changes from culture to culture, as you mentioned. I think we do tend to put greater emphasis on those things that we associate with good meaning. If a man or woman sense of what they have done wrong, we'll still not want to put them in a situation where they may be tempted again. And we do that to protect them. What we say, but really we're trying to protect everybody else from them. Now, I don't think either one of these men you mentioned about this even talking at all about what their past mistakes. Because if it's gone and it's tempted on it, why are you bringing it up anymore?
Well, it exists here
I get that. But why bring it up?
because it exists here.
Again, why, to what benefit? There really is no benefit to bring up either one of those situations.
Well, there's a sort of therapeutic quality to talking about your past.
I'm talking about those to your audience.
Oh, sure, like maybe if
I
you're
don't need to
preaching,
get
yeah,
into-
that's maybe.
I don't need to get into details of my past and my past sins to convince people that these things are wrong.
Right, that's true. And
And God's word is the convincing thing, not my experience with it.
yeah, well,
I mean, but again, that's really how we work. That's how we act.
Why did Paul always introduce a story in the sin?
yeah, I was
Because,
gonna.
well, part of that we didn't know how Paul looked like. Paul's looked right back then, unfortunately, the same way he's looking at today, of being better than a lot of other people.
Oh, I don't know. I think if he had killed all my family for being Christians, I wouldn't look at him in such a bright light, you know? As a matter of fact, it showed that a lot of people were very suspicious of him when he first became a Christian. So he was alienated for a long time.
People were like, well, again, you had evidence. I'm with Paul. I'm with Jesus,
Right.
I'm with Paul.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
and
But
so, you know, today, I don't know how many times I've heard, how many different, it seems to usually be preachers, no offense to those who do that, but boy, when I get to heaven, I'm gonna spend some time with Paul.
yeah,
So my point is, why does Paul even want to spend time with you? You know, I got all kinds of questions for Paul. I mean, compared to who?
right. You know, God.
I mean, it's really, when you look at that, in eternity, we're gonna be pretty much with God.
Yeah. Yeah, I always thought that way too. I always thought it was funny.
You know, I mean, not being mean to anybody.
Right, sure.
I mean, if you're gonna have all these people there, what?
Right, but to Quentin's point about relatability, I think that's really important. The idea, especially from a preacher. Now, definitely, you don't. A lot of times, it's a matter of tastefulness, not to go into certain details about your own past that would be non-beneficial. But a lot of times, it is true that someone who's listening to a sermon really can grab onto the truths of it if the person who's preaching it understands where they're coming from. And the thing is about me, I haven't committed every sin in the book. I've committed quite a few of them, but I haven't committed every one. And there are some people I can relate to better. And I think since I've gone through some of the same things as some of you, there might be some of you that I can help better. But beside the point, I was really talking about, talking to your friends about it, or just in general, the general impression from the community toward an individual, not necessarily a preacher, but anyone. Why is it that, say, a former, prostitute might feel uncomfortable talking about her sins and talking about her issues that she has as a result of them, say, in a congregational setting, as opposed to anyone else? I'm saying she shouldn't have to feel that way. What I'm saying is we shouldn't base how we react to a sinner or someone who has sinned on the consequences of their actions, but on the mental state of that person, whether or not they've repented, which is what you said as well. That should be our judging factor, I guess, or our factor on how we choose to react. Now, I saw her hand up a long time ago, so you go ahead.
Well, in answer to your prior, why do we place a bigger importance on sexual sin? Because most of the time, it's not something we're doing to ourselves or against God, where there's somebody else we're really injuring by it. And if you have a person who you know, it's even like, say, for example, or in the church building when they released a person who was a child molester, there's a picture put up. I mean, they have to know where they are and everything. They pay the consequences for what they're doing.
Right.
Definitely. And I think that if you had someone in the church that did that, you would never let them be in charge of taking the kids on a trip or anything like that. You wouldn't even want them to be in contact with your children because you know that was his weakness.
Right.
Now you take Job. Job said, "I have trained my eyes not to lust after a woman." I mean, we know that you can overcome those sins if you really, and then you can go to the other side where Paul says, "I wish everyone would be like me," so then everybody thinks that you know, they'll come up with that. We probably shouldn't marry, you probably shouldn't do this, and that's not true either. That had to do with the circumstances, I think, that was going on at that time, the persecution.
Right. Sure. Yeah, those are excellent points.
So usually when I hear this talk about the primary one that's brought up is one of my friends who is a counselor, a Christian counselor, gave this, he said this one time, and it's always stuck with me. He said, there's sins, there's bad sins, there's really bad sins, there's really, really bad sins, and then there's homosexuality. And that's how I feel like things have been viewed. And usually homosexuality is the one that I think of where people talk about the whole still judging for the sexual sin after the fact.
Yeah.
And I really think it's more going back to what you said originally about the anger. It's more of you are angry and think, this is a little bit narcissistic, that they might view you that way. And that's really what we have a problem with, is that it's, to us, the reason they're detestable is because in some way we think that it affects us, even though it might not.
Right.
We have read our own experience into what the sin that they committed was.
Right. Right. That's a really, yeah, that's profound. That's a really good point. And that applies to everything. But it manifests itself most clearly in those particular, I guess, taboos that we have much more extremely. But it's almost the idea of we've made a scapegoat for ourselves, right? The sins of the community, for one thing. I mean, or our own sins, or perhaps the anger, more to the point, the anger that we have toward ourselves for our sins can sometimes be projected onto someone else because of theirs. And, you know, well, that's a dangerous road to go down. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this, as you said, it's not right, but the anti-ranking of sins, we rank the worst, the ones that are probably referred to the least amount of people, versus something that lies is probably lying to just about everyone.
Right. That's true.
You know, versus a murderer might murder one person and be incarcerated. You know, but yet the liar lies to hundreds or thousands of people.
Definitely. All right. We've got to stop for now.
This conference will now be recorded.
Glenn, can you make your point that you made to me regarding this discussion?
I mentioned in passing that we talk about sexual issues concerned with the Me Too movement. The fact is that we group what technically would be gender issues into the same group of sexual harassment, and that we won't solve the both together, nor split the group, because they need to be addressed in two different ways.
Right. Right. And I pointed out it's a really interesting idea that, and it's true, that it seems as if, at least in the church, we try to tackle the issue of gender roles, right? That's what we focus most on. What can and cannot women do as opposed to what men can and cannot do in the church? And we hope that once the roles are set in place, once the roles are set in place, really, then the sexual issues will take care of themselves. That's the idea, right? Now, would you disagree or agree with that?
I would say that's somewhat of what the church does.
Right.
And I would say the church has an advantage over the world because we have those defined roles where, for example, men are shepherds or bishops, not women. Right. In the world, that's no need. There's nothing wrong in the world with having a woman supervisor or owner of a company or president of the United States or anything like that. Just because of gender. Right. But there's a whole lot of people that, even within the church, the roles that God gave in the church need to apply to the world. And that's not so.
Right. You know, however, there was a time in which they kind of bled forth into all areas of society, right? I mean, at the time, you know, in the church, there was, you know, strict, guidelines for the roles of men and women. And that was also true for the society as a whole, right? Now, it's interesting that, well, I won't advocate for or against either of those ideas right now. What I was thinking, this is the point I want to make, is that, let's see, how should I say it? One second.
Treating them as one idea hinders the resolution of either one. And the fact is that, no, having to define roles does not change the misconduct of, okay, we'll just lump it all in sexual harassment. But a number of things does not, no, we won't do that because the roles do not define. That's not where Scripture, you don't find them defined in the same spot. You have what God considers acceptable sexual relations, find in one spot of Scripture, and what the roles are, especially since the church wasn't inwardly defined in a different part of Scripture.
So our issue is we have too many things that are casual. Our relationships in general, in the public sphere especially, are too casual. Everything's too casual. You can see that in really every facet of society, even down to the way we dress, is much more casual. That itself isn't the issue. That's just, I guess, neither good nor bad. Well, maybe sometimes bad regarding taste, but neither good nor evil, moral nor immoral result of this more fundamental issue, which is that everything's so casual. When a relationship is casual, the lines for what is acceptable in them are blurred, right? And when a relationship is formal, you might say there's less affection and love involved. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. But it's at least true that when a relationship is more formal, it's much more simple. You understand where you stand with that particular person, what's allowed and what isn't. That's particularly true. As a matter of fact, when I first thought of that, it's from a strange place. This miniseries called The Young Pope by, who's the guy who played it? He was, Jude Law played this guy who becomes the young Pope, and he's like in his 30s. It's a really interesting, funny show. But he's this really strict guy, and he's the Pope now. And there's this woman that's going to cook for him, and she's being all, nice and friendly with him and pinches his cheeks and everything. And he like really talks her down and he says that basic idea. It's like, the formal relationship is very clearly understood. Of course, he made her cry, which was sad. But it was interesting. The idea is actually true. It is simpler, right? I mean, the fact is, our relationship with God, it is formal to some degree. Right? I mean, I hope that you can get past a certain point. When you get closer to someone, the less formal it becomes, right? So, for instance, when you just meet, say, a girl, at least initially, this used to be more the case. Even this is somewhat different now. When you first meet a girl, like when I first met Laura, I didn't act as if she was my wife already, right? And we weren't very close yet, and we didn't really know each other. We had just met, right? And so, there was a little bit more of a formality. I acted, I guess my social self. There's a different way that you act, especially when you started dating. And you have certain guidelines either set by parents or set by yourselves on what you'll do. And you kind of have to have sort of, to some extent, a formal relationship to some degree. Now, the closer you get, the closer you become, the less formal the relationship becomes, right? And I guess there's always a danger of blurring certain lines, even in a marriage. I think some people get this crazy idea that once you're married to them, then there aren't lines anymore. That's obviously not true. Those are negotiated between the two partners. But I think the interesting and important thing about that, regarding our relationship with God, is when you start out so very young, it is kind of formal. You understand God basically as it's taught to you by your parents and by other people and other sources. And as you get older, you want to move closer to Him. And it is more intimate in that sense. The relationship with God ought to be. But, since God is obviously God and we are obviously not, there is a sense of formality there as a subject to His king. That analogy still holds even when you're close to the king. You're still His subject. And when that's the case, you understand very clearly what's expected of you, what's expected of Him. So my idea is if you sort of go back almost to an older, basic, not very complex, or at least not very difficult, code of conduct between men and women. The old idea. I was amazed by how this practice wasn't abolished very long ago. I was watching the Dick Van Dyke Show, and which is in the 60s, they were like 1960 was when it began, I think, or 61, one or the other. And I noticed that even at that time, even as late as 1960, Dick will be sitting down, and a woman will come up, say in a restaurant, and all the guys stand up. Oh, hi, how are you doing? And there was, and as a matter of fact, even there was this little girl that came up to talk to him when he was sitting down once. He stood up just a little bit when she left, and I thought, it's funny, you don't sometimes notice those things when you're just watching a show or a movie, but think about that. And I thought about and kind of have read a lot about former codes of conduct between the sexes. And we think, oh, that's just kind of, it's this empty chivalry that we want, men do it to make themselves feel better about themselves, perhaps, or we put some sort of cynical nonsense onto the motivations for doing that. What it did was it had some sort of formality between the relationships between genders. And I think it had a really good effect, and probably would still, where there are clear lines as to what you would and wouldn't do. Our problem with, I think, maybe as a result of our increasing globalization, we understand so many different cultures now. And in the United States, we have, in certain parts, of course, we have so many different cultures that have come together. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But what has happened is we don't have a unified, you might say, dogma for culture for how you act in public anymore. My mother always made me put my napkin in my lap, and that's always really strange because I'm usually the only guy who puts a napkin in his lap when I'm eating with someone, And that's a small example that doesn't really matter particularly. It's not like it really does you much good in your lap, It's on one leg and it'll still get on your shirt. It doesn't make any difference. What is really would be better is if you put it in your shirt like they used to do. That actually makes more sense. I digress. The idea of casual relationships, though, it really messes things up. Even sex becomes casual in that context. And that has not been a good idea for us at all. We have not had good results from having casual relationships to that degree, because it's caused casual crime too. It's caused a lot of those issues that we have. So maybe, that doesn't mean we become prudes, right? I don't think we should go too far in this. But if we sort of at least try to teach our kids that there is a certain way, and certain groups still do this. I think Christians do this probably a lot more than the world in general. But I wish we would I hope we try to influence the culture around us to do some of these things as well. Maybe it's as simple as, kind of standing when a woman enters or that sort of thing. And those things are, the actual content of the custom is superficial as far as I'm concerned. It's the idea behind it, whatever it is, that's the most important thing. And that formality, to some degree, I think would be helpful in the relationships between the sexes. I think that has been the reason why we've had all these issues, is because the relationships have become, all in all, much too casual. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I've always told my girls that to wait for their husbands to open the door. Eventually, even if they go in and forget you, they'll get hungry and come out and look. Just wait long enough, and they will do it.
Well, Laura had it. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Not once. No, I will. Laura had this old boyfriend that used to lock the door so that he could get around and open the door for her and wouldn't let her out. Now, maybe that's going a little too far because it really is almost for you more than for her at that point. And that's the thing is, what's the reason for it? It's got to underneath be making life better for everyone else and easier and more convenient for everyone else. And anyway, I guess that's a little bit beside the point. But regarding those relationships between the genders, that's what I would suggest. Now, the thing is, though, I want to get to the crux of the matter before we move on into related areas. And that is about, I think we understand adultery is wrong. And almost everyone agrees, even many people in the world, that you've made a commitment to someone, and what would be wrong is you're hurting them by going off and breaking that commitment, right? And say sleeping with somebody else. Very few people think, oh yeah, that's fine to do. Some do, but even most Christians that I've talked to would think, yeah, that's not just good to do to just up and leave for no reason, whatever, or to cheat on them. Nobody likes cheating, right? Now, I think the interesting thing and the important thing about that is it's not so much the sex itself, which is the most evil thing to that, because we see in the church, at least I was talking about, our hierarchical standards, which are sometimes misplaced. The fornicator is not so bad as the adulterer, right? I mean, the young girl who had sex before marriage, that's bad. But this woman who cheated on her husband, that's even worse. Like, well, okay, the consequences might be worse. But bear in mind, we don't react to sinners based on the consequences of their actions, but on the state of their hearts and whether or not they've repented, right? Then we can work from there. The thing about adultery is, and this is interesting, talking about hierarchies of sins, Dante's Inferno is an interesting source for, thinking about that. One man in particular, and perhaps he's representing a culture, their understanding of what was the worst thing. And really, I think it's a really ingenious idea, because what he does is he has the different levels of hell in the book, and he goes down to the very bottom. And the question is, what is it at the bottom which creates the rest of the evil for mankind? That's really the idea, is what, certain evils rest on other evils. Certain bad motivations rest on something that lies at the bottom. So what is it which is at the bottom of hell? And I was expecting that maybe sexual sins would be pretty close to the bottom. That's just what I thought for some reason. That seems to be the general character of Western Christianity, is sex sins are some of the worst. With Dante, they were actually close to the top. You started out with people that maybe really genuinely loved each other and didn't really want to do bad things with each other, but they ended up doing them because of, you say, the lust of the flesh. And people that didn't have bad motivations, but they just kind of let their desires run rampant. You had those people. You had cheaters, that type of thing. Well, actually, that wasn't mentioned, actually. It was anything regarding sexual sin was kind of up near the top, and you had other things more insidious at the bottom. And I think what the interesting point about it, and there's some truth to it, that at the very bottom of hell was Judas, and he was being eaten by Satan. And Satan was this giant demon-looking thing with wings in the book, and he was chewing Judas up. And that was the idea, was that at the bottom of hell is betrayal. Because when you're betrayed, when you trust somebody, obviously, if your enemy does something evil to you, it's not a betrayal. It doesn't change your worldview so drastically. You expect your enemy to do wrong to you. But when someone close to you does wrong to you, when you think that things in your life are this way, the relationship is this way, and we're in this particular case, and we're in this situation regarding each other, and you see that that is completely wrong. It changes your whole worldview completely. You can see how it affects a lot of people psychologically, completely messes them up. And I think that's the thing about adultery too. It's not so much the sex, it's the fact that you betrayed someone. So I wanted to mention that because we do kind of put that above. And I want to mention that it's not really connected to the sex per se. It's more connected to the fact that through that act, you've betrayed someone. And at the bottom of every sin is a betrayal against God. That's the true nature of what sin is. So I wanted to mention that, and we need to keep that in mind. But the next question really is, okay, what about, say, fornication or sexual sin in general, but specifically fornication, because there was a particular instance where this friend of mine he had sex with his girlfriend outside of marriage, and they were both members of the church, and he called me one time. He said he wanted to talk to me. Right, had come out, and there were some loving reactions and some unloving ones. And my friend wanted to talk to me about it. Well, I figured, he wanted to talk to me about how bad he felt, or saying how sorry he was about the whole thing, or he just wanted to have someone to talk to about his guilt. That's what I thought he wanted to talk about. I was surprised, but I shared with him. I think he had a good attitude in this. I think he was just genuinely curious. He started to think about these things. What he wanted to talk about was this. He asked a question: what's so wrong about me having sex with my girlfriend? It didn't hurt anybody. We're both adults, both over 18. We both consented to it. It was agreed upon. What's the harm? Why is fornication a sin? What do you think? It's a hard question. I think it's important to think about, because we tell our young people, don't go off and have sex outside of marriage. And they ask us, why not? If we're not hurting anyone, why not? I don't know. I think so. Yeah, we did on the way to free. I think. Anyway.
Then I'll say my point. Let somebody else go first.
Well, I don't know if anyone else is going to talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's a couple of different things, I think. One, going back to betrayal, is betrayal against God's model of how he wants man and women to interact.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That one of the things that he thought was important was a committed relationship between man and woman. That was important. Mm-hmm. And in his design of the universe, it was an important aspect that he made. Really, it was the one thing he said wasn't good, and this was the correction for it. The other thing is more of a biologic aspect, that there are certain chemicals that are released whenever someone is intimate with someone else that cause them to react in a different way for the rest of their life toward that person, even if they are no longer romantically.
Right.
There's a couple different ones, but oxytocin seems to be the main driver, that even with somebody who you may not have thought of, the first relationship that you have had such a degree of the release of that chemical that whenever you find out something has happened to that person, the same center of your brain is activated. So that it's like God designed us to have this particular way of interacting with one another.
Right.
And the other part to that is in future relationships, you still will have that reaction to the first person that you were intimate with, which can cause problems. Not the same as adultery, but it can still cause problems in the relationship that ultimately becomes marriage.
Right. And that's the biological basis for the whole idea of you never quite lose the first spark. Have you ever heard that before? Your first love, that type of thing. And well, that's not always true. It's, I think, definitely more true if you've had sexual intercourse with that particular person. That would be the biological basis for that. And really, the fact is, what is it that is said about marriage, about Adam and Eve and what they did in Genesis? How is it defined? The man and the woman did what? What's that? Right, they became one flesh, right? And what does Paul say about someone who has sex with a prostitute in 1 Corinthians 6? What does he do with that prostitute? What does he say about that? You become one flesh with her. That's an interesting idea to me, that the act of sex itself is equated with the marriage. And as a matter of fact, throughout many cultures, throughout history, the idea of consummating a marriage. Are you familiar with that idea? Is you can have a ceremony where you say, this man is married to this woman and everything. But in most cultures, it wasn't actually true until you say the marriage was consummated. In other words, until they actually had intercourse. And there were a lot of interesting ways in which they could verify whether or not that happened, which are very strange. And I'm glad we don't do that today in our particular society. Regardless of that, there's an interesting connection between the act itself and the marriage. You might say you are marrying yourself in a physical sense, and obviously in a biochemical sense. You are marrying yourself. You're attaching yourself to that person. It is obviously not intended for, a casual context, right? Because it is not a casual thing at all. Nobody actually sees it that way. They may act like they do. And maybe you can work this if you say do it enough, or you're lascivious enough, promiscuous enough, you can get to the point where it doesn't matter anymore. But what has that done to your soul? Soul maybe is too abstract of a term in this case. What has it done to your psyche, to yourself, when you can have that type of deep physical relationship and emotional relationship with someone, or do that thing, and it actually not mean anything to you? What does that say about your ability to form meaningful relationships? Now I saw this hand up first. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think men look at it totally different than women look at it.
Probably true.
Now, you're giving from a man's, okay, this man came in to talk to you, and
right.
To me, that it doesn't even, to a woman, that wouldn't make sense. Well, you've already said, okay, if you love me, a man will say, if you love me, then you will have sex with me. I need you, I love you. And a woman would say, if you love me, wait for me.
Right. Now,
women want a commitment that they know they can trust, that's going to be like,
right.
They don't want, after, like you said, it's not the sexual act. Well, maybe to a lot of women it would be, because they don't want to share that relationship with someone else.
Right. Yeah. The fact is, like I said, everyone hates cheating, right? Why? Why do we hate cheating so much if we don't think that there's anything special about that activity?
But don't you think women or men can forget that a lot easier than a woman?
Yeah, there's definitely, it seems to me that motivations for sexuality, what is it? A woman has to feel love before she can be comfortable usually having sex. A man usually feels love because they're doing that, right? There's kind of a difference in need, and that's a generalization too. You said that the conscience can become seared, right? And that's true for women too, though. I have heard women say the same thing that I've been saying, which is, it doesn't really matter. Now, I think women probably have to go through a lot more searing than maybe a lot of men do to get to that point, because it seems, naturally speaking, since women are so relationship-oriented and that type of thing, that it's really hard to get to that point. And that's what I think we've seen in the culture in general, is we're so seared to these things. We're so desensitized. We don't understand how important of an object of an act this is. Now, I want to, okay, so it makes sense, it's a pretty good rationale for why that would be wrong. And I think we need to start thinking along these lines when we talk about sexual sin, especially with young people, because they want to know not just what I ought to do, but why I ought to do it. Because if there isn't a why, then why should I do it in the first place? There's a good, I think, good thoughts there. Thank you, guys. Now, relating to this, I want to get into a few other things as we get to the close of this. Now, there are a few issues that I kind of lump together, although they have some distinctions, they also have some commonality. But they're common things in the church. One is modesty. That's definitely related, as far as we're concerned, to sexuality. Now, my problem with that, though, is that in the scriptures themselves, there is never a direct correlation between sexuality and modesty. In both the cases where modesty is mentioned by Paul, or well, the one case by Paul in 1 Timothy 2, and then by Peter, when he mentions wives, he's talking about them and saying, I guess, don't worry so much about the outward adornment, but let your adornment be, I guess, that of the hidden person. So it's more a matter of, who you are, I guess, spiritually speaking, who you are as a person rather than what you look like as a body, right? That's an important idea. But in those contexts, it seems as if they're talking about dressing up a lot more than dressing down. And in Paul's particular case, in 1 Timothy 2, he actually says the specifics were, braided hair, gold, jewelry. It almost seems as if it's, more of a, you're putting more on than you need than taking off. It's not necessarily sexual. What it is any sort of getting undue attention to yourself, trying to stand out to the point where you're trying to get attention for yourself. In other words, perhaps, I suppose, you take yourself too seriously. And of course, this can be done by men. There are, I think, different reasons why it would be more especially important to mention it regarding women. That we won't get into. That's kind of beside the point, I think. But I guess not wearing enough would also obviously get you to the point where you're drawing undue attention to yourself. Now the problem is, what's the standard for that? What's not wearing enough? And what's wearing too much? By the way, that's one we don't ever talk about ever. Is when is a person wearing too much? Do you think my 3-piece is a little too much? Maybe in this particular context it is, because no one else is even wearing a tie. And maybe I'm overdressed. I don't know. What about it? Either one. What's the standard? All right. Now, okay. Now, I think, did you have your hand up?
No, but I would say culture, but also environmental location. Obviously, should dictate dress.
Sure, sure.
Mean, if I'm up here in January versus Texas in January, I'm going to dress different.
Right. Now, that's not a matter of like morality, though, is it? I mean, I guess it's not a sin if you're sweating.
It does set some of your norms, right?
Sure, definitely. Right. Okay, I see. Those two connect.
There is
yes.
a strong thing that men should never wear shorts together.
Not in Florida.
Well, right.
Right, exactly.
In Florida, but up here, that does carry some. I'm not saying it's right.
Right. Well,
but I've heard that.
Right. I think you're on the right track. I like this. The cultural norm is important, and I think there are 3 main things that I would take into account regarding, like, okay, someone's dressed a certain way. One, you have to take into account the context, right? Now, this would also be, I was thinking, because my older sister is a ballet instructor. And a lot of people have an issue with some of the outfits that are worn, say, by dancers. And to some degree, I think you can say fair enough. Even in that particular context, sometimes it's just too much, or I guess in this case, not enough. Now, but the context of, say, a ballet recital does change things. And I think that's important. There's a difference between, say, wearing a tutu and dancing on a stage, when everyone's there for that reason, with a particular, say, aesthetic purpose in mind to see a ballet, as opposed to wearing that walking down the street. Different context, different reactions from people, right? So that's something you should take into account. The second thing is the attitude of the person, right? And I think this could also apply to the issue of art, like what, photos being taken and paintings being drawn. There's been a lot of discussion among some circles lately of whether or not nudity in art, say the classical Greek and Roman art or Renaissance art, is okay because they have some nude figures in there. Now, I think that, the context of it is important as well. I also think the purpose of the person, I guess, of the perpetrator, that's kind of the bad word for this particular context, but the purpose of the person doing this, whether it's the person who's dressed or the person who's done the painting, that's an important thing to take into account as well. And then I'd say the third one is, well, the person who's viewing and where you stand on a conscientious basis, right? I think those 3 things are important to think about. Now, I saw a hand.
I think that sometimes it would be better off if you had no clothes on at all than what you're trying to project at some I mean, I think that probably a person sometimes would be less desirable with no clothes on than some of the clothes that they wear and what they're.
Depends on the person.
Well, I'm just, what I'm saying is, depending upon what they're trying to sell or whatever.
Right, that's true.
I think
I
a
think that's
person,
true.
I think, you know,
Right. Well, think about this too.
and even in art, you look at how art is. Now, we don't,
Right.
art doesn't portray them as having just a, you know, it portrays the body as it is.
Right. Well, sometimes it's idealized. Like in the Greco-Roman art, it was definitely idealized. But I think there's a inherent respect for the human body in that particular context, right? Which isn't there, say, at a strip club. There's a completely different context and purpose for viewing it and making it. And the thing about it is, well, say take the context again, say cultural context. I went to Pohnpei, Micronesia on a mission trip when I was 17, and a lot of the women there didn't wear tops, or they did maybe just a bra for their top. And the fact is that as in that particular culture, breasts aren't particularly seen as sexual, right? They're particularly seen as maternal, right? They're motherly. There's nothing really associated with sexuality regarding breasts, and that's not true in our particular culture, but it is there. So you might argue it doesn't really bother guys over there. Doesn't, you know, there are different standards there. There are different things that you're used to, that you've grown up with, and that will definitely affect it, you know. And I think that what we're talking about is completely subjective as far as what causes you to lust. That's really something we think about. There's the idea of standing out. The way that Paul is talking about modesty is definitely based on culture, because he talks about braiding hair. I mean, and I assume many of you women still braid your hair, because that's not an unusual thing to do in our culture, or gold or jewels. I mean, we're a very wealthy culture. Anyone can afford something that at least looks like gold jewelry. And so, you know, the culture, he's not definitely, his standard would be whatever's normal at the time. The problem is, when you think about, say, sexual or lustful dressing, immodest in that way, you have to think about the person, right? So you as a person, what you're, you know, able to view and be okay with. Also the purpose of the dress. Now, I think this is where the culture might sometimes not be the proper guide, because our culture is very sexually oriented. And a lot of the clothes made for, say, men and women, by the way, are designed to elicit sexual arousal. That is the express purpose for much of the clothing. And so, you know, and obviously, you know, so in that case, it's usually pretty obvious, right? And we pretend like the cultural lines are so blurred, and that's not particularly true. There are points at which they are, but generally speaking, you know, all of us sitting in here, we're all dressed very decently, you know, and we would be able to tell if someone wasn't, because they wouldn't be so much like us and like what we're used to. It becomes pretty obvious in the actual case, you know. So I think, you know, taking that context into account is really important. There's a funny idea that I've come across many times, which is that the Bible actually has an objective standard for what nakedness is. And that the robe that was given to the priests in the Old Testament is the standard, because the word for robe, which you might want to look into this for me, because I don't know a single word which can be this specific. The word for the undergarment, let's say, for the Levitical priests was a garment that reached down to the mid arm and to the mid thigh. And so anything beyond that would be considered nakedness, and that's how far your clothes have to go. Now, granted, it doesn't say anything about tightness. So that's a different matter entirely, and it doesn't account for that.
I do know that's what the Mormons base their stuff on.
Yeah, well, a lot of people in the church do, a lot. I've heard it a lot. And I think it's completely ridiculous, for one, because for one, it was only applied to the priest, not to everyone else in Israel. That's a red flag right there for a standard, okay? The other thing was the express reason was because the priests had these flowing robes, and they were going to be up on a platform, right, above the people. So you can kind of deduce for yourself why they needed the undergarment, and the reference of, you know, so they would not show their nakedness. Often in the scriptures, this is a misunderstanding. In the scriptures, the word nakedness often refers to the genitalia, or the particularly private parts of a human being. That's called the nakedness in general. That's really how you should understand it. So that's not really a good definition or a good standard at all. Go ahead.
Right, and that's seen too with the number of steps for an altar that's given.
Right, how many were there?
I don't remember the exact number,
Me
but
neither.
it references that.
Oh,
so
I
that your nakedness would not be
Right.
on the altar.
Right, okay,
Again,
so,
who's on the altar? Ain't no person on that altar. It's God,
Right. right, well,
So, well, I'm saying as far as, I mean, that's the reference.
okay,
It's a, I mean, the altar was for God,
right,
for the
right,
sacrifice to them.
right.
But I mean, that's what it is, just like you said, it has to be with too.
Right. Now, yeah, that's, yeah. So I think the context for these things are important. And I think this is important to talk about because, take, okay, say modesty, nudity in art, dancing, as I think is another thing that you take the same criteria and apply to that. The context, the purpose, what exactly is being done. That's a strange thing. I don't know if it's something particularly an issue in, say, Wisconsin, but in the South, a lot of times you have people who I won't name just to be nice, Christians and famous, pretty well-known preachers at least, that will wholesale reject the practice, say, of dancing as a completely sinful activity. And the thing was, just like 2 generations ago, you had normal people. I know this old lady at the church in Maple Street who talked about how, her and her husband, when they were younger, they used to go out and do polka dancing. And it was just a normal thing. She was a member of the church, has been her whole life, very conservative in other areas, but dancing as a sin never occurred to her. It seems to be that kind of basically a cultural thing as well. Southern churches of Christ particularly have an issue with some of these things that others just don't have. And I think it's important to talk about these because we've gone too far to the extreme in saying you can't do this and I guess, well, for one thing, dancing in general, completely sinful, and just going so far to where we will basically, you've got this idea. This is Christianity, right? This is what Christ said. This is what it means to be a Christian. I've drawn these lines. And what I do is I'm so afraid that I'm going to go outside of them, that I'll draw them even smaller and force that on everybody else. That is just as bad as going beyond the boundaries. At least that's what the scriptures say. And that's what Jesus says. As a matter of fact, Jesus hardly talked about the sinfulness of the Sadducees, right? Now, he did talk about the Sadducees, but mostly the Pharisees. And I think it's interesting because the Sadducees were the completely liberal people who wanted to say, basically, to some degree at least, a lot of the old laws don't matter so much, and you can kind of push the boundaries out. That's what they did. Now, that's bad, and I think people, generally speaking, knew that was. People that were convicted of sin, of commission, you might say, things going beyond the law, he, made sure to deal with that, and it seemed evident that they knew what was going on there. But what he mostly focused on regarding the established interpretations of the day was on people making the box so small, on the Pharisees, on people that forced their traditions over what the scriptures actually say. That is important, and probably the crux of the matter for Christian ethics, for us today, right now, is making sure that we aren't so dogmatic on a lot of these things, which, as Paul says in Romans 14, some of which are disputable matters. Not everything so black and white. Not everything merits a disfellowship or a withdrawal from another Christian, right? I think we need to think about what's our goal in discussing and trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong and what we ought to do. It should be the basic, I think, attitude of a Christian should be to try to make relationships, to try, if we can, if we at all possibly can, make connections with other Christians and with other people. Not have as our first and basic attitude to disconnect from everyone. Because when you really take that idea down to its logical conclusion, you'll disconnect from absolutely everyone. And even find that when you're the only person left alive in the church, you are just as bad. You can't really disconnect from yourself. So these are important issues. And obviously, we didn't even touch the surface of all of the moral issues that a Christian can think about. But I hope that we have done is kind of started to develop some tools from which you can go ahead and start to make moral reasoning on your own. And that's the important part, is making it on your own. You can't rely on a teacher or a preacher to make your moral decisions for you. Nobody can but you. You have responsibility for your soul. So think about these things and think about the idea that when we want to figure out what's right and what's wrong, we need to think about the character of God, right? What is he like? What is the characteristic that God has? And how does that disseminate into a universal principle which can apply to me in every specific situation that I have? How can I go about trying to figure out how to imitate Christ and live the gospel in my life? That's essentially Christian ethics. Now, what questions or comments do we have before we close? Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. I've enjoyed this. Now, Laura and I are going to be moving this week, and so I guess I won't see you guys for a while. Hopefully I'll be up for a visit next year sometime. We'll see. But thank you very much. And